Returned to India 1935 to 1937. The grand mission did not begin immediately. Liaquat Ali Khan had written come, but there was still some torment in Muhammad Ali Jinnah's mind, some reluctance to return to the open seas of conflict he would have to endure. He did not act with his usual quick determination. During 1934 and 1935, Jinnah was a restless traveler. In April 1934, he was back in India, denying his own belief that there was no hope of unity. At a meeting of the Muslim League Council in April, he said, "Nothing will give me greater happiness than to bring about complete cooperation and friendship between Hindus and Muslims." He returned to London, still caught up in the strange conflict between his old ideal and his reason. In October, while he was in England, the Muslims of Bombay elected him an independent member to the central legislature without seeking his consent. The news that he was needed by his own people reached him within the untroubled comfort of a London hotel. In January 1935, he sailed for India once more to attend the first session of the new assembly, but in April, he returned to England, where he remained until October. While Jinnah was in London, the king gave his royal assent to the Government of India Act of 1935, which remained unaltered in its principles until the transfer of power to India and Pakistan. In 1947, the benefits of this act are described by the Australian statesman Mr. R.G. Casey, who was governor of Bengal from 1944 to 1946. He wrote, "The Government of India Act of 1935 was a big step towards self government, and it went considerably beyond the recommendations of the Salmon Commission. In the provinces, responsible government was established over virtually the entire field of subjects, ordinarily falling to a province in a federation. In nearly all matters, the governor was bound to act on the advice of his ministers. In a few matters, he could legally act against advice. In still fewer matters, he could act even without advice." These safeguards were very few, and the governors were particularly enjoined not to exercise their powers so as to relieve ministers of proper responsibility. In fact, the overruling powers were very little used. The second part of the Government of India Act 1935 was designed to secure the federation of the whole of India and to introduce responsible government at the center. But it has never come into force because the princes refused to join a federation, so the center carried on as before. The provinces, now increased to 11, were given almost complete autonomy and were made secure from central interference in the exclusively provincial field. Each was to have its own elected ministry, with all the portfolios in the hands of ministers elected by the people and chosen by the leader of the majority party. In the structure of such elections, the several minorities, whether Muslim, Christian, Parsi, European, depressed classes, or Hindu, were to be safeguarded by the just apportioning of seats, voted for in separate communal electorates. It was implicit in the new constitution that, so far as possible, each provincial ministry should include ministers selected from the minority parties. The pattern of representation, described as the communal award, had been devised by Mr. Ramsay MacDonald's government after the Round Table conferences as an attempt to satisfy the minorities, the Muslims in particular. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was not satisfied with the award, but in a speech made in the assembly in February 1935, he said that he was prepared to accept it because, having done everything to come to a settlement, no scheme of constitution would otherwise be possible. Early in 1936, Jinnah played his part in an act of conciliation that was significant for two reasons. In the city of Lahore was a mosque, once the property of the Muslims. The Sikhs had usurped it, and after much wrangling, there was one more cruel explosion between the Muslims and Sikhs of the Punjab, ending in riots and the imprisonment of the leaders. Jinnah went to Lahore to cool the belligerents with reason. Here was an opportunity to prove that unity between communities was possible. He brought the contestants together. He used the words constitutional methods, like a bludgeon, and induced them to accept legal arbitration. The governor of the Punjab recorded his official thanks. He wrote, I am greatly indebted to the efforts of Mr. Jinnah for this improvement, and I wish to pay an unqualified tribute to the work he has done and is doing. Mr. Jinnah succeeded in his first task, namely bringing the Muslim agitation to strictly constitutional and legal lines, and has thus made it possible for government to take action for which they had been awaiting an opportunity. The episode was important because it had obliged Jinnah to apply his theories to a specific incident. Important also because it revealed Liaquat Ali Khan's influence on his leader. Up to this time, Jinnah had never stepped down to mingle with the people in their troubles. He had usually theorized over them from afar. But within 12 months of the first elections under the new constitution, Jinnah was learning to come closer to the voters who were to decide the shape of India's political affairs and his own destiny in the next decade. The elections were to be held in the first weeks of 1937. As early as 1934, the High Command of the Congress Party had begun their preparations. Their own parliamentary board, comparable to Labour's Transport House or the Conservative Central Office in England, was formulating policy and briefing the selected candidates. The opposition of whom Iqbal wrote, I shed tears of blood at the indolence of Muslims. Your carpets are Persian, your sofas Western. Were almost 2 years late in beginning their campaign. Early in 1936, the Muslim League met in Bombay and decided to form their own central election board with Jinnah as president. The Muslim League was indolent no longer. With Liaquat Ali Khan at hand to interpret Jinnah's orders and wishes, the League came alive again. In March, Jinnah spoke to some of the members in Delhi. He said, we must think of the interest of our community. Unless you make the best efforts, you will fail and will command no respect and nobody will bother to consult you. Organize yourselves and play your part. The Hindus and Muslims must be organized separately. And once they are organized, they will understand each other better. And then we will not have to visit for years for an understanding. I am helping 80 million people. And if they are more organized, they will be all the more useful for the national struggle. It is folly to think of the Muslims and Hindus as if their differences were as clearly defined as those of two armies on a battlefield, one bearing the standard of the League and the other the standard of Congress. The error comes easily to those who are used to such simple devices as Tory and Labour, Republican and Democrat. Behind the fronts of League and Congress were spread a multitude of people, strangely divided and opposed. Not all the Hindus belonged to the Congress party. Many of them were liberals and independents who disliked the revolutionary policy of the Mahatma and his disciples. Nor did the 80 million Muslims march as one man. In the Punjab, especially, where they were in a majority and in no danger of Hindu domination, there were popular parties of Muslims, led by Muslims, that had flourished long before Jinnah awakened the moribund League to contest the 1937 elections. They were not likely to leave their proven parties to join the revived League, which was still weak and young. Some groups of the Muslims were ardent supporters of Congress. The NWFP, where the Muslims were 90% of the population, was a Congress stronghold. In this part of the country, the home of the stalwart Pathan Highlanders, not a single Muslim League candidate had been returned to the legislative assemblies. The Muslims in the province of Sindh had openly disowned the League. They allied themselves with Congress and opposed any suggestion of partition. Jinnah was therefore attempting a prodigious task. In asking these Muslim communities, unaware of each other and scattered over thousands of square miles, to organize and regard themselves as one undivided army. The caste of leaders in India had changed during the years of Jinnah's absence in England. By 1937, Gandhi, who had made boycott and mass civil disobedience into a sullen and terrible force, was 67 years old. He was now something of an oracle, clothed in mysticism, and he left the laborious task of Congress to a younger man, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, aged 47. Mr. Nehru called the Mahatma Bapu, or father. 8 years before, in a speech opposing the Round Table Conference, Nehru had said, "We have not the material or the training for organized violence. An individual or sporadic violence is a confession of despair. The great majority of us, I take it, judge the issue not on moral but on practical grounds. And if we reject the way of violence, it is because it promises no substantial results. But if this Congress or the nation at any future time comes to the conclusion that methods of violence will rid us of slavery, then I have no doubt that it will adopt them. Violence is bad, but slavery is far worse." Nehru was less challenging during the campaign for the 1937 elections. He did not talk of violence, but of the value of constitutional opposition from within the Congress. Jinnah was to say of him, "He is a Peter Pan. He will never learn anything or unlearn anything." Nevertheless, Nehru led the army of Congress workers to victory at the polls. Out of 295 millions in British India, 30 million held the vote of these. 30% were Muslims. The League candidates recorded less than 5% of the Muslim votes that were cast. Nehru was naturally confident after this heartening victory. Early in March 1937, shortly after the elections, he said that there were only two parties in the country, Congress and the British. Jinnah replied, "There is a third party, the Muslims." And he added, "We are not going to be dictated to by anybody. We are willing to cooperate with any group of a progressive and independent character, provided its program and policy correspond to our own. We are not going to be camp followers of any party. We are ready to work as equal partners for the welfare of India." Pandit Nehru and Congress remained scornful, and Jinnah's offer to work as equal partners was ignored. Sir Percival Griffiths, a former leader of the European group in the Indian Central Legislature, has written of this grave tactical blunder. The Congress High Command refused to sanction Congress League coalitions, and in the Hindu majority provinces, ministers consisting only of congressmen were formed. In the United Provinces, for example, Muslim representatives were invited to join the ministry, but only on condition that they become members of the Congress party and that the Muslim League cease to exist. In other provinces, similar conditions were imposed, and with one exception, members of the Muslim League were rigorously excluded from office. The Congress party was fully within its rights in adopting this exclusive policy, and may even have felt that it was following normal parliamentary practice. There can be little doubt, however, that it made a grave tactical blunder. There was no difference in social or economic policy serious enough to make Congress League coalitions unnatural or unworkable, and the Muslims therefore felt, rightly or wrongly, that they were excluded from office merely because the Congress was essentially a Hindu body. Jinnah returned to his desk in the house in Mount Pleasant Road, discouraged but not in despair. He worked alone with no personal staff and not even a secretary to copy his letters and keep his papers tidy. But there was one bundle of letters in a drawer to which he could turn for consolation. They had been written to him by Sir Muhammad Iqbal after the meeting in England in 1932. On 28 May 1937, Iqbal had recorded his belief that to make it possible for Muslim India to solve her problems, it would be necessary to redistribute the country and to provide one or more Muslim states with absolute majorities. And he had asked, "Don't you think that the time for such a demand has already arrived?" There is no record of Jinnah's reply to this letter. On 21st June, Iqbal wrote again, "I know you are a busy man, but I do hope you won't mind my writing to you so often, as you are the only Muslim in India today to whom the community has a right to look up for safe guidance through the storm which is coming. Jinnah heeded this letter. In a speech at Lucknow on 15 October, he said, "The majority community have clearly shown their hand that Hindustan is for the Hindus." He warned his listeners that the present Congress party policy would result in class bitterness and communal war. Mahatma Gandhi considered Jinnah's words carefully and wrote to him, "As I read it, the whole of your speech is a declaration of war. This is written in all good faith and out of an anguished heart."